and welcome to this Conservative Home event titled What Happens After COP26? How do we accelerate progress towards net zero without breaking the bank? I'm Charlotte Gill, the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, and today I'll be chairing a discussion on how businesses, individuals and government can make net zero a reality both affordably and sustainably. During the course of today's event, we'll be looking at what we can expect from COP26 and what should happen after it. We'll be asking how the government can fulfil the urgent demands and ambitious promises to accelerate progress within the limits of household, business and even state finances. And we'll also look at the impact of eco-policies on the cost of living, particularly at a time when the public is going to have to pay rather a lot for a pandemic. How can decision makers ensure more effective action on climate change without breaking the bank? And with me to discuss these topics, I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Griffith MP and the government's net zero business champion, Clementine Cowton, Director of External Affairs at Octopus Energy Group, Ted Christie-Miller, Senior Researcher getting to Net Zero Programme Onward, Greg Hands, MP and Minister of State for Energy, Clean Growth and Climate Change, Professor Nick Robins, Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance at LSE, and Kulveer Ranger, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Communications and Northern European Lead for COP26 at Atos, UK and Ireland. So we've got a really full room today and we've got a really full panel. I want to have a really engaging discussion. I'm going to ask the speakers to speak in the order of introduce them. Then we're going to have some questions, and I'm sure you, the audience, also have a lot of burning questions. So do get involved, do have a think while you're listening, and we'll get stuck in. So Andrew, do you want to take it away?
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, and what a fabulous turnout. I think it shows the pertinence of this issue, how salient it is, not just, what a young audience, so to all of our lives, also to the important role of the Conservative Party. So Atos and Conservative Home are to be congratulated. And I think the strength of this panel, the sheer number of us, are testament to the level of interest and knowledge, not some redundancy that your net zero champion may not be adequate to the task. Look, this is about COP and COP26 and what happens beyond that. And we're fast approaching. I think we've got 28 days and counting to the start of the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, the biggest ever climate event that's been hosted in the world and certainly hosted in the United Kingdom. But as I've long said, once we expect our world leaders to make the most of what the COP president calls our last best chance to take action on climate, once they put away the flags, once they fold up the sort of chairs that you're sitting on, the tents are collapsed, and we go back to the real world, it is business and innovation and what I've always called the ferocious problem-solving power of entrepreneurship, of private capital, that's actually going to solve this crisis. And it's exactly the same force that's got us where we are today, not just in finding a vaccine, but also over the last 150 years, extending the length of human life by more than double, by lifting trillions of people out of poverty, or billions of people out of poverty across the world. It's that life force of business and innovation and technology being deployed that ultimately is going to solve this, and Charlotte going to solve this at a price that we can all afford. So don't lose sight, and I hope that we've got representatives of business, two fantastic businesses operating in this domain on the panel today, and we mustn't lose sight of that in all of the conversations we have around policy, on the role of government and citizens. Actually, it's business that's the life force that's going to solve this. And in the process, we are going to throw up huge opportunities, huge commercial opportunities. We're going to see new businesses created, whole new sectors of the economy globally that don't exist today. Jet zero aviation, the hydrogen economy, decarbonised energy generation, vertical farms. We're going to have hydrogen ships transporting goods, electric automotive. And these are going to be great opportunities. And if we in the United Kingdom can be just a little bit ahead of the rest of the world, just as we were with the original Industrial Revolution. And we have some formidable natural competitive advantages in terms of the attractiveness of our economy, our rule of law, our English language, our science and technology base that Minister Hans and his department are busy fueling and providing more fuel to in terms of government spending every single day. So we take these natural advantages. We take some of our geographical advantages. You know, we prospered in the first Industrial Revolution because of our forests, because of our coastline. And exactly those same opportunities are allowing us today to create things like the Saudi Arabia of wind in the Dogger Bank and to decarbonise our electric grid faster than almost any other country. You should be enormously proud of where the UK government is in this whole agenda. We have set far-reaching and ambitious targets, and that is right. We have these formidable soft power assets. We hold the G7 presidency. We are hosting the climate summit itself. We have a significant role of responsibility and leadership within the Commonwealth. So it's right that we set ambitious targets, and it's right that we also look to make that transition at a point when we can open up to the world, we can attract private capital. And as we create these new low carbon industries and economy, we can then turn that into a platform for exporting that innovation across the whole world. I'll give you my final thoughts on the role of government in this. The first thing that government needs to do is to be clear and set out the long-term demand curves. That provides the environment against which private capital, businesses, entrepreneurs can go and arrange their businesses. And I think the government's doing a proud track record of that, and Minister Hans may talk some more about that, but you've seen in examples like automotive, our ambition to turn off coal within almost a matter of months now by 2024, that the government is shading out those long-term demand curves. The second thing that government can do is provide some of the pump priming that take nascent industries and allow them to scale up and to work with industries and innovators. The Net Zero Innovation Fund, which if you follow my Twitter feed, I'm very assiduous in regaling you with all of the interesting stories of how businesses are coming forward with new technologies that are going to allow us to decarbonise. And then the final thing that doesn't get talked about enough is government spends a huge amount of our money. Government is a big state actor in the economy in its own right. And I'm delighted that government procurement policy is rotating towards net zero and making decarbonisation one of its core objectives in how it spends money, because the amount of money government spends, local, national, is far dwarfs the amount it will spend on things like research and development. So it's got that multiple role to play. So Charlotte, thank you for putting this panel together. I hope that there's some thoughts there about the centrality of business and innovation, because I think that is what's going to allow us to reconcile the important work of saving the world, of creating this transition as quickly as we possibly can, but also because we're all here because we want to deliver for citizens, we want to make their lives better in a more tangible way. It is technology and innovation and business that will do that. Thank you.
Brilliant. So Clementine?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to ConHome for such a diverse panel. I also wanted to take the opportunity to congratulate Andy Street, who yesterday refused to speak on the conference stage because he was on an all-male panel. So very well done, and thank you to him. I'm really sorry. I would also just like to take an opportunity while I've got an audience to just mention that last night I was violently assaulted in the conference zone by a man in the Midlands bar. So sorry to dump this on everybody. It was a bit of a surprise, but I do want to just take the opportunity to say women are often unsafe in places where other people feel safe, and it's really important that we start to take that much more seriously as a society, and starting with the police. I'm fine, by the way, don't worry. Anyway, so on a more optimistic note, I'm Clem Cowton, Director of External Affairs at Octopus Energy. Octopus Energy was started with a mission 5 years ago to tackle climate change and to bring down bills, making energy cheaper and fairer. And those two things, we believe, are completely complementary. In fact, they're reliant on each other. And the way that you do that is through digitalisation. We have this enormous opportunity with the resources of renewable power to have what is effectively it's free fuel. Once you've built the power station, the actual cost of running it is incredibly low. So you've got this amazing resource of very low marginal cost power, if you can just make sure that you are using it at times when it's available. So the opportunity here is that we can harness the wind and the sun and water to bring us incredibly cheap power. Now, the challenge is to match up those cheap electrons with times when people want to use those cheap electrons. And a really important part of that is to effectively charge for electrons in the system using price signals. So, set up an architecture of a system where, rather than everyone paying the same thing all the time for everything, you run the grid. At the moment, the grid is run a little bit like a kind of minicab rank, where someone kind of makes a phone call and there's a bunch of kind of buttons being pressed at a desk. What we need it to be run is a bit like Uber, where if there's a surge in demand, price goes up. If there's a lot of extra capacity on the system, price goes down, and you use price signals to move electrons effectively around the system very efficiently and at very low cost. And actually, so Octopus's Kraken technology, which is the foundation of the company, is set up to do that. So, and we started 5 years ago. We've now got 3.1 million UK customers. Our Kraken Flex technology is operating in 12 countries. And we were last week announced that Al Gore's investment fund Generation invested $600 million in the company, valuing us at $4.6 billion. So, but I'm not just bragging, by which I mean to say there's a lot of money to be invested here, and there's a lot of the energy industry is a $3 trillion industry globally, set to grow to $5 trillion. We have the opportunity, as Andrew has said, to lead that industrial revolution, and to take those opportunities for Britain, and to in fact see the kind of the kind of massive investment that you see in digital technology in Silicon Valley. We can lead that. We can be the Silicon Valley, never mind the Saudi Arabia, the Silicon Valley of energy in the UK, and attract that kind of investment. How do we do that? We make sure that our own system is able to foster and pump prime those technologies that will be exported around the world. And those are renewable power, digital technologies to enable demand response and Uberization to happen, and heat pumps, which I can talk about later if anyone would like me to, but I think I've gone on for too long now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Clementine, and thank you for sharing your story. I'm wishing you very well. On to Ted.
Yeah, thank you. So, a bit of background first about Onward and the Getting to Zero programme. So, I run the Getting to Zero programme at Onward, and the key aim of our programme really is to dig into some of those sort of practical and political barriers to decarbonisation in the UK, and try and provide some practical solutions for policy makers to take forward. So, that's what we've been doing for the last sort of year, and Onward will continue to do a lot more in that space. Firstly, I think it's just worth saying that the cost of inaction vastly outweighs the cost of action. Even at the OBR's estimates that they put forward, they're looking at a sort of a net cost of sort of 12 billion a year, which is roughly the same as the aid budget. It's still a huge amount of money, and it's a considerable amount of money to invest. But actually, if we wait any longer, those costs do just multiply and multiply. So I think it's vital that we act now. And I think, as Andrew said earlier, there's serious advantages, commercial advantages of us being first movers on some of these sort of key technologies. So, I think if we do invest now and we really have the right regulatory and funding environments for some sort of innovative technologies like hydrogen, like you were talking about, nascent industry like direct air capture, renewable heat, like what amazing things Octopus are doing, there is this amazing export opportunity. And so while this may include sort of big capital costs in the short term, it's also, in my view, a sort of deeply conservative thing to invest now to save money later. So I think it's really the right thing to do, and I'm glad there's such emphasis in it with government, with Andrew's role as well. And I think, as Ben Houchin actually wrote in the Times this morning, I think net zero is not a fad, it's here to stay, and it's an enormous economic opportunity. And as we found in our own research as well, there's an enormous jobs opportunity, particularly in the North Midlands and Scotland, and as we all know, those are the sort of electoral battlegrounds of the future. So there's the political opportunity there for the Conservative Party as well. But with that being said, there's also it's crucial that the costs of this transition are not borne too heavily on consumers and taxpayers. Recently, we did some focus groups in Redcar and Southampton. And the overwhelming message there was that people are really keen to do their bit for net zero and to tackle climate change, and they are willing to pay more for certain things, but there is a limit on their patience. And actually, there's a danger if we don't do this right and we don't look after low-income households specifically, that we lose that democratic support. And that, to me, is the biggest danger of not doing this right. And those people are quite rightly worried about the cost of living, and that is obviously an increasingly live political issue as we've seen over the last couple of weeks. And I think it's really the moment now to do this right and to make sure that people are not significantly sort of worse off from this transition. And as the sort of policy wonk on the panel, the think tanker, I think it's probably right that I try and plug some policy ideas to the Minister while I'm here. And we've done sort of a long list of different ideas over the last year, so I'm not going to bore you, but there were just two things that I thought were worth highlighting here. And the first is sort of rebalancing carbon prices, and then the one I'll get onto later is just private investment, really catalysing private investment. So looking at the consumer angle, like we're talking about, I think is an important thing to rebalance the incentivisation of different things. So we campaigned hard for the government to move the levies, from environmental levies on gas onto electricity, and there was a briefing into the FT that this is potentially being explored, which would be brilliant, and I applaud that if it's going to go forward. And then just looking across the economy, there's a number of imbalances that need to be settled. Like, for instance, the average cost of a flight to Edinburgh from London is £54. The average rail ticket is £126. I mean, that is just a stark realisation of actually the carbon intensity of things are not reflected in their price, and that needs to shift if we are to do this. I think, as I said, I talked about low-income households earlier, and I think there's certain changes to tax which can be done in a progressive way. So I talked about aviation. In last year, the last year before the pandemic, 50% of the country didn't take a flight, and so actually it's really the richer half of the country that would be tackled by an aviation tax, for instance. And in our polling, it really comes out strong that people would support a tax on aviation over other options. So I think there's certain things that we need to look at and look at keenly to move this. And then second was how we can mobilise private capital for big green infrastructure. And I did a paper last year sort of calling for a development bank, and now the UK Infrastructure Bank has been created with a sort of a green emphasis, which is a really great thing. And I think the Green Infrastructure Bank from the 2010 sort of era had a mobilisation rate of 3. So for every £1 invested by the state, there was sort of £3 invested by private capital. And I think if we can replicate that for the UK Infrastructure Bank, it could be a really great thing and get lots of private capital into green infrastructure. And then green gilts as well, which welcomed a lot when that was announced, and they've raised sort of 10 billion so far and is subscribed by 100 billion. There's huge market demand to invest in our green infrastructure, and I think these are really vital tools to be able to do that. So I think that's enough from me, but yeah, those are the two angles that I think would be important to double down on.
Thank you, Ted. So Greg, over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, conference. And first of all, what Clementine had to say, her shocking account of last night, just to say that we all stand with you, Clementine. If there's anything that can be done to assist the investigation, then I think we would all, in this whole conference, wish to assist in that. But thank you for telling us about it and making it, giving such a real example of such a big challenge that this country as a whole is facing at the moment. Thank you. plenty going on in this space. I've been Energy Minister now for about 3 weeks, and it's been an interesting time to take on a new portfolio. I've not been the Energy Minister before, but I have been the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and I've done various roles at Trade, which are related to this sector. But it's a massively important sector for the country and a massively important sector for the government, for the Prime Minister. I've just come straight from the main hall, listening to Ben Houchen interview Kwasi Kwarteng about the green industrial revolution, the levelling up agenda, net zero, the connection right the way across. A big, big part of the party's overall agenda and the country's overall agenda. A few things just to say on energy. I think our objectives are straightforward, is to make our energy supply more diverse, so more renewables, offshore wind, nuclear, solar, hydrogen. There'll still be a role for oil and gas. The Climate Change Committee itself has said that there'll be a role for oil and gas even after we reach net zero, but more diversity in our energy mix. Secondly, more security. Actually, and the two things are pretty closely related. One of the great things, for example, about offshore wind is that it is almost by definition homegrown. We're not dependent on Vladimir Putin, President Xi, or anybody else for that. It is a UK product. But not just that, we're also building things like interconnectors. Last week I was in Blyth in the northeast to see the new UK-Norway, which is actually another first. It's the world's longest subsea electricity interconnector, start operation for the first time with one of our best international friends. Finally, also just to keep the lid on bills. That is absolutely part of the government's agenda. The energy price cap is here to stay. There's different government schemes to make sure that we try and keep energy as affordable as possible. And I think the current spike in prices across a number of different sectors actually shows the need for all three of those things. All three: a diversity, security, and keeping the lid on bills as well. I think moving forward, we've got some real challenges, though, as a country. We've got to do better on buildings. We have got better in the last 10 years. We need to do better on public and private sector buildings, our housing stock, making sure that it's become more energy efficient. With COP coming up, we need to use the UK's leadership position, which Alok Sharma and the Prime Minister, I think, are doing brilliantly, exploiting the UK's leadership in this section. Because, of course, the UK is only responsible for 1% of the world's emissions. You know, we need to be making sure that we have the moral authority to help persuade the other 99%. The good news there is just since the UK took over the chair designate status, the amount of world GDP covered by net zero commitments has increased from 30% to 70% in that time. We need to mobilise finance. We need to get businesses, particularly SMEs, more comfortable, more assured. There's a great website, businessclimatehub.org. Anybody who's from an SME, I can really recommend that. We've set out government policy overall. It starts with the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. Very digestible, relatively easy, good introduction there as to what the government is doing overall, published last year. We published a hydrogen strategy last month. We've got the net zero strategy coming later this month, and the Treasury's review of the cost of net zero. So I think we are in a good place. We've got a lot of challenges coming up. But I wanted to end with this, and that is actually we should show incredible pride in our achievements as a country and as a government in this space. I'm going to take you back. I'm going to slightly show my age now. But the very first election that I really remember well, which was memorable for no other reason other than this one reason, and that was the 1989 Euro elections. Now, I don't know that many people here will remember that kind of earth-shattering election. But it was memorable perhaps for one thing, and that was this, that the Green Party in this country had its record ever score in that election. And they ran on a platform that it was impossible to reduce emissions, to take action on climate change while still growing the economy. They're effectively a zero growth party in 1989. And they got a record score, but thankfully they didn't win overall. But what we have done as a country and as a party in that time has shown them that they are absolutely 100% wrong. We have actually grown the economy by 78% since 1990. whilst cutting emissions by 44%. So we are winning that argument. We need to win that argument again and again and again, that going green will not make you poorer. Going green is an essential part, and net zero is an essential part of our future economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And now over to Nick.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and again, my sympathies with you, Clem, for your assault yesterday. So, great to be here. My name is Nick Robins. I'm a professor in practice for sustainable finance at the London School of Economics, and my focus is really looking at the world of finance, the banks, the investors, the capital markets, and how they can be mobilised for driving the innovation that we've heard about. I think what is great about COP26, and we've just heard that, is COP26 in a sense has already delivered. Not enough yet, but already the momentum towards it, we've seen huge progress. For example, in the financial sector, there is a global financial sector alliance for net zero. This is $80 trillion around the world, led by many UK financial institutions with 250 companies. That is already committed. So the capital is there, and I think what increasingly is those financial institutions are looking for the deals to invest in. In terms of the narrative, I think probably all of us would understand, people in terms of entrepreneurs and so on, that this is an investment-led process. We put capital up front, and then from that capital we derive a series of returns. Returns for investors, returns for our country in terms of driven down investment, social returns in terms of jobs, and then macroeconomic returns. This is going to be a very good story for our overall growth. We're going to have stronger growth because of this, in part because we're going to be investing in our homegrown talent, our infrastructure, and not invested in foreign fossil fuel imports. So I think that theme of this being an investment-led process is very important. Clearly upfront capital, but I would not see that necessarily as a sunk cost. This is an investment to yield return. Clearly, this climate change is also, unfortunately, a market failure. Markets are not currently reflecting the costs of carbon, which is why we need carbon pricing and why policy matters. And again, I think certainly in the last year or so, the UK has been a real leader in terms of signalling net zero, but also getting the financial sector to move. I've worked quite a lot on encouraging the UK government, the Chancellor, to come forward with a green sovereign bond, which is raising debt for the government to spend on our priorities, but doing that in a green way. 2 weeks ago, we came out with the biggest green sovereign bond ever, a real market signal from the Chancellor. UK Infrastructure Bank, set up with a dual mandate, both of net zero, but also supporting local economic progress across the country, a really important anchor institution. And again, the Bank of England, a leader in so many ways, but the Chancellor has really shown leadership by changing the remit of the Bank of England so it is also focusing on these net zero goals. And I think as we've heard, there are still some ways to go, particularly on the housing sector and designing those products where people feel able to invest, and particularly where we're protecting low-income households from this process. And I'd like to end maybe on that question of people. We talked about investment, the importance of policy matters. The work I did for the Climate Change Committee suggests that actually good policy really drives down the cost of capital. Could drive down the cost of capital from about 17 billion a year to about 3 billion a year. But people, in the end, this is all about people. It's protecting people from the costs of unrestrained climate change. And in the COP language, this is known as the just transition. How do we need to, we get to net zero, but how do we do that? By linking it to the levelling up agenda, both domestically, but if I may, thinking about levelling up globally. So what does that mean? Again, the government has come forward with has commissioned a Green Jobs Task Force, a really good initiative. Lots of things there about building the skills. Regions. For every 100,000 people in this country, we have about 4 billion in investable assets in our ISAs and pensions. How do we mobilise that for regional development? Entrepreneurs, we've heard about the importance of harnessing SMEs. Many SMEs I speak to feel very patronised by this debate. How do we make sure that their energy for this is mobilized. And then I maybe end with the big emerging countries. We have a very strong business and financial sector, very connected internationally, but we're going to win this net zero race if we really bring on the Indias of this world, South Africas of the world, and so on. And that's going to be one of the key challenges for COP. But again, showing that this net zero race is positive for their development, which it can be, I think is going to be a real signal for success. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And now, Kulveer.
Thank you, Charlotte. And now, as I say, a word from our sponsor. But before I speak, Clem, I'm absolutely disgusted to hear about what happened to you, and I echo the words that we stand with you in anything we can do to support you. So, because I'm rather happy to be here. It's been too long to see you all, and what a fantastic thing to have a room full of people, not just here at conference, but interested in this topic. I personally have been coming to conference for almost 20 years, so it feels like coming home again. But from a business perspective, would 20 years ago we had a room full of people wanting to hear or talk about sustainability, about going green? I'm not so sure, Greg. It was challenging. In the intervening years, the Conservative Party's done a fair amount. I remember Vote Blue, Go Green, the former Prime Minister, really pushing an agenda, but I still felt that it wasn't quite there with everyone, because it didn't feel like sustainability was at the heart of everything for all people, and it wasn't just a cost, it had value. And I think that's where businesses, and now yes, it is time for a word from our sponsor. Atos, we're a global IT business. Not many people would have heard of us, but we make sure things link together. We put the plumbing in. We make sure the data's managed, the cybersecurity is there. We're number 1 in Europe for cybersecurity, number 2 in the world. We defend and protect things like the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. But the critical part to all of that, and this is where it comes down to, we've heard about energy and data. Our world is becoming increasingly driven by technology. And I remember having this conversation with a man who's Prime Minister now, when I worked for him when he was Mayor of London. And as Mayor, Boris asked me to take over the environmental brief in 2011, and I wasn't very keen on it, let me put it that way. I'm a transport person, I wasn't an environmentalist, but Ranger, do to transport, do to the environment what you've done to transport, which was basically get a message out, get people engaged, keep it simple, deliver a few bicycles, which we did as well. But he wanted it to resonate with the people of London, to make sure it had value and that they understood. And I said, Boris, we can do this, but I think we need to do it another way. We have to bring technology on board. And actually, he agreed, and at that point we set up the Digital Office for London. The reason being, almost everything we are going to do, to whether it's driving to get to net zero, whether it's encouraging businesses to be more efficient, whether it's us as individuals managing our own energy, our needs, and the services that we want to use, will be underpinned by some element of technology. We are now, and will be in the future, a digital society. And a digital society that must be sustainable, and must be sustainable by design. So as a business, if we are helping to manage data and those vast data centers that we have that host all that immense amount of information that's being driven from, yes, your smartphone, but your smart meter, your electric vehicle, your streaming, your television, not a single service of device that we all use is not adding to the burden of data and energy and carbon. And we must work on reducing that. So our role is to do that. And I can happily tell you now that I've depressed you a little bit about how much we have to deal with, is that we've been doing this for quite a long time. We've been redesigning our data centers, our supercomputers, to be the most efficient in the world. And it's the reason I do proudly say that we are the #1 IT service provider globally, rated by the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for the last 2 years for what we do in designing sustainable infrastructure. But there's much, much more we can do. And yes, we're committed to net zero. Our net zero target is by 2028, not 2050, not even 2035 that we first decided on, because the goalposts keep changing. And that's one of the things that we must ask when COP happens. And by the way, is anyone here going to COP? A few people. Okay. I like to ask that because I want to actually know how many people will actually be there. Because there's going to be this big conversation which is going to affect all of our lives. But we want some clear outcomes, Minister and champion on business. We want clear messages about what standards we should go for when it comes to achieving our targets, because they have been moving and they might move again, and I'm sure you're aware of that. And the reason I say that is we as business can deal with these moving targets and these moving standards, but it takes time. To redesign big infrastructure, big technology, takes time. Not only that, but critically, we need to get the message out to everyone else, to people, about their role in it. Because if we all understand the role we're playing in reducing our consumption of energy, of how our data is being managed, both securely but also in terms of how much energy it requires, and the role we play in reducing that, then we'll have a little bit of control, a little bit of understanding, and make good decisions. We as a business want to make good decisions. We want to be pushed to make good decisions in government procurement, and we're pleased to see the changes that are happening in government procurement. We actually lead the way in some of the consultation there. But fundamentally, we want to make sure that we also create the right environment for business with jobs and investment that we want to make to deliver the standards and the improvements for the future, to deliver not just net zero, but way, way, way beyond that. So I'm delighted to be back here. I'm delighted to see all of you. Thank you, Minister, for your time. Thank you, fellow panellists, for joining us. And I look forward to a really good discussion and us all doing a lot more than when we get to net zero and beyond.
Thank you, Kulveer. So lots to think about there. One reason I was really delighted to do this panel, especially is because I've recently actually done a bit of a feature on the cost of net zero. I went out on foot and sort of interviewed people about, I don't know if anyone's heard of low traffic neighbourhoods, which is the most boring thing I'm passionate about. But essentially, and I think this will play into our discussion, because we're talking a bit about, we want to protect people on low incomes from these costs. And I think there's a bit of like future speak there, but when I interviewed people, I was finding already they're feeling very burdened with having to move to electric, especially freelancers. Like if their company can absorb the cost, that's a bit better. But I feel that there's like maybe a bit of a disconnect between talking about it at the macro level and people on the ground feeling the cost. So I wanted to put the question to Greg and Andrew. How will we convey these costs, and how are we going to make people feel a bit more relaxed about them? Because I didn't hear a lot of relaxation on the streets, but people were quite stressed. So what do you think about that, Andrew?
Well, the classic definition of stress is when you are in a situation and you have very little control. That's what human beings find stressful, and I think that's a metaphor for a lot of this, that there is a danger, and it's a trap we should not fall into, and I think businesses like Octopus are fantastically liberating in this space, that people feel this is something that I'm being told to do by you, whoever you are, big government, global leaders, but I don't have the levers and tools in my hand to actually do anything about it. And that is the classic definition of stress, and it's very disempowering. Now, I'm much more optimistic about this. I think we can easily resolve this, but there are too many points where people don't have enough information. There's a lack of standards, and we'll learn all of this. This is absolutely true of every human problem that's ever existed, is that we start with a big, hairy problem. It's a little bit inaccessible. There's an elite that talk about this problem immensely, but it doesn't translate down to actions that we can take, levers that we can pull. Day by day, people are putting those in place. Pick an Octopus, but there are many other brilliant energy suppliers who are doing exactly that. Too many of these domains have been inefficient. You know, often because they've come from a state background, and we understand that doesn't often provide a proliferation of choice and different technologies. I mean, if we think about how we really solve this, it is a data optimization issue, right? We are heating homes that we are not in. We're lighting streets that no one's walking down. We sit in congestion when, you know, a modest algorithm, of which Kulveer, I'm sure, has many, could solve these. So we're going to solve this effectively by smart technology, the smart applications. And in the meantime, I'll finish on this, Charlotte, because you've got a big panel, a lot of people. It's really important that we come forward with things that people can do. You don't have to map into abstraction your carbon footprint to know that you don't need to make unnecessary journeys. You could aggregate deliveries. You can choose the green slot on your supermarket delivery. There are lots of empowering things that people could do. And one thing that when I came to this debate, there's lots of sustainability experts on this panel. I've always thought my greatest contribution to this domain is that I don't come from that world. I come from a consumer business background where you have to make things brilliantly simple for consumers to eliminate the friction. People want to make right choices, by and large. They intuit the right thing to do, but you've then got to give them the tools and the ability and the nomenclature to do that. And I think where we find my role as champion is to do precisely that. It's to show people that as between two alternatives, you choose the lower carbon glass when you're buying a new product. You look at, you know, labelling. Labelling's very deficient in this space. But there are other domains in which we know, well, this one's got a little bit less salt in. So there's a lot of work to do. But if we do that, we will harness that fantastic power of us all as consumers. That will send market signals. That will allow whole new businesses. I mean, it'll allow some jeopardy for legacy providers that don't get with the program, and that's the nature of the Darwinian business side of how you drive innovation to scale. But you'll also create fantastic new businesses. I hope some of you are sitting in the audience thinking about your entrepreneurial idea and seeking to get capital from Nick and his colleagues and going and deploying that, because that's how we'll solve it, and we'll bring consumers with us.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I wanted to get a bit more specific. In terms of when I'm asking Greg, what would you say to someone they've just upgraded their electric car again, that type of consumer? What would you say that there's going to be an end to this in terms of the cost to incorporate in your question?
Yeah, thanks. I would say, first of all, I totally agree with what Andrew said about data. I mean, data is absolutely the key to driving down costs in pretty much everything that we're doing. I'd look at it really two ways, the basic question, then I'll come back on EVs in just a moment. But I think the cost is worth looking at both sort of the input cost and the output cost. In terms of the input cost, we actually, to be honest, we've rather surprised ourselves with how we have reduced the costs of various renewables. When I was at the Treasury in 2015 and we set budgets for renewables, where was the expenditure going to go from the government? Most renewables were looking very expensive at that point. Offshore wind was one of the ones that actually looked quite expensive. But it was put to me by the industry, plus also by officials in both BEIS and Treasury, that offshore wind was going to become significantly cheaper, and that the pricing that we'd seen in 2015 would not be the same as the pricing that we would see at the end of the spending review period in 2020. And that turned out to be absolutely correct. In fact, today the cost of offshore wind is about 2/3 what it was in 2015, and actually the price of electricity generated by offshore wind is about 1/4 of what it was then. So do have faith in technology, faith in Britain's ability to innovate to keep those prices down. The second area is on protection of consumers. So the retail energy price cap, which was controversial, is working and is currently saving millions of households quite a lot of money on their bills. And of course we have support for things like the Warm Homes discount, the winter fuel payments, and so on. Now that's not to say there aren't price challenges that are out there. That will continue. Much of this is outside of anybody's control on this panel or even beyond. A lot of it is, of course, is driven by global prices, which is what we're seeing in gas and in fuel at the moment. I think in terms of your question about how do we keep up with adaptation and how do we keep the cost down and how do we stop people getting in the position where they've invested in what was the hot technology of that year. I'm thinking, always remind myself of Kulveer, and probably remind me of sort of Sadiq Khan, who proposed diesel, and the government went big on diesel in 2008, 2009, when Sadiq Khan was a transport minister, and now he's preaching against diesel today. And I always think that's a good lesson for politicians in general. But look, I think we have to be always thinking ahead, always looking ahead. That is why the government sets out the strategies that it does, starting with the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, the net zero strategy coming. All of these things later this month, all of these things will map out the direction of travel, which will hopefully minimise the degree of inconvenience to consumers by having to first adapt and then having to readapt.
Brilliant. Does anyone else want to come in on this point about
I would actually.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you're talking about electric vehicles. Octopus has an electric vehicle company, Octopus, imaginatively named Octopus Electric Vehicles, which is we lease EVs. So no one's forcing anyone to buy an electric vehicle, and in fact, actually, petrol vehicles are still overwhelmingly the majority of new cars sold in this country. What we have done, though, is made them really great bits of kit that people really want, and we're driving the prices of those down incredibly fast. So the cost of owning, whole cost of ownership of an electric vehicle is already cheaper than a petrol vehicle. When you buy it, and then it is a bit more expensive to buy, but then very, very significantly cheaper to run. And over the course of its lifetime, and also, by the way, requires very little maintenance. So there's not as many moving parts. It's basically a sort of sewing machine on wheels. You've got the actually, and then predicted that the actual kind of sticker price of an electric vehicle is going to beat the sticker price of a new petrol vehicle by about 2025, if not sooner. So, and I say that not because I'm sort of bristling at the kind of slagging off of electric vehicle technology, but more to say what's happened there is we've enabled a market to scale. Prices have come down. That technology is now popular and cheap, and it will get cheaper and more popular. And that means that you can help people's pockets and make something popular without ever having to do anything to kind of harm the environment. So, and I would suggest that the next kind of big thing to do that in is in heat. And this is where I think maybe the diesel analogy might fall down a little bit for the government, because I would suggest that it's worth thinking about whether hydrogen for heat might be the next diesel. In that, the cost of heating a home with hydrogen will cost, by the government's own calculations, 9 times more than heating a home with an electric heat pump. So we need to be very careful about making decisions that lock customers into expensive technologies in the future, and making sure that we're using readily available low carbon technology today, but investing as the government I know plans to do, to pump prime that market to bring down those costs in the same way that we have done with electric vehicles.
Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, Kulveer.
But as we are talking about electric vehicles, and I agree with what Clem's saying, in fact, electric vehicles, does anyone know when electric vehicles were first sort of on the streets?
My nana drove an electric van in the war.
Well, there you go. But 1890, electric vehicle technology has been around for a very, very long time. It just got overtaken by the great petrol industry, and diesel industry, and combustion engine. But we actually set up the London Electric Vehicle Partnership under the Mayor Boris Johnson in 2008 to bring increasing electric vehicle technology into London. And it's great to see where that's gone, especially with the source network and everything else that the country's done. But it is about accessibility. And Clem's right, the pricing of vehicles, vehicle technology, and everything else around it should now democratize, because I'm conscious of the fact that I can go to certain parts of our country, or even London as a city, or even Manchester, and find a plethora of electric vehicles, and then go to other parts, there won't be any. And there is an issue of affordability. So that's one thing that we do have to look at when we look at markets. But the real issues, and Clem touched on this, is about the silo approach that we're making to these interventions. Whether it's about household heating, whether it's about vehicles, whether it's about other things such as air quality and various things like that. We need to be cautious that as government's policy looks to develop and turbocharge, and I hear the word pump prime a few times, various parts of this market, that it's not the consumer that's left confused about where all these things are happening. And I can tell you an example of that confusion. If you get to a point and you look at your smartphone and you've got 5 or 6 different apps running different parts of your life and all trying to manage these things together, suddenly you realize, I just need another day just to manage all my heating, my car, this. It starts to overcomplicate. I think, Andrew, you mentioned, we have to keep these things simple. And I think we have to step back and think about, what are we asking people to do? There's a cost associated with all of this. There's investment that's associated with all of this, but it won't take off if it's overly complicated and if it's not integrated. I think government has a real opportunity to think about this. The reason we as a business are so concerned about this, and why we speak again about a digital society, is large businesses like ours service all parts of the market, whether that be health and life sciences, manufacturing, financial services and industry, telecoms. We are across the board looking at these markets and seeing the change that's happening and trying to ensure that things link together. So we, from a business perspective, are trying to do that. We also require policy and government to look across as well. Because as long as we can see across and bring things together, it's not just a health app, it's not just a car app, we start bringing these things together, we'll make it easier for people to adopt, adapt, embrace, and lead the change. And I think we have to always come back to the point that it should be citizen-led, consumer-led, demand-led to where we go and where we invest.
Brilliant. Nick, would you like to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, because I think one of the things, clearly the threat of climate change is catastrophic, and I think there is a sort of broad-based maybe sense of what I could call climate anxiety. That as maybe in your job, maybe you're feeling that your job is going to become redundant because of this, and you're in certain sectors. As a consumer, you're going to face these costs. As an investor, you could have stranded assets. So I think, along with the technological innovation and building what Kulveer is saying, I think we need to be building some social innovations as well. Again, in this country, it's really good. We've seen citizen assemblies, we have citizens' juries. So we overcome this idea that this is a top-down process where people have no ability to input, and actually think more about a bottom-up process. We, with a number of other universities in Leeds and Edinburgh and Belfast, have set up what we call the Place-Based Climate Action Network. And that is really to make sure that individual citizens, entrepreneurs, councils, trade unions and others are involved in these bottom-up processes. One process is going on at the moment in Yorkshire and Humber, a huge part of our economy. And that I think enables people to resolve some of these anxieties and actually find issues and solutions which are relevant to them. Financial solutions. We're now seeing a new range of local climate bonds with local authorities coming out with that. So I think one of the ways of addressing this sort of climate anxiety is thinking about sort of social innovation processes as well.
Thank you, Nick. So I wanted to come back to the COP26 and ask the panel some questions about that. So I wanted to ask, what does success look like at COP26, and how do we avoid participants playing safe by agreeing targets and actions that are easy rather than necessary? So perhaps, Ted, you can lead on this question.
Yeah, thank you. So we've done some research on this in the past as well and made a few recommendations about what sort of things we want to see at COP. The first one really was coal, as a commitment on coal, and we've already seen quite good success by the government, I think, in influencing China to stop setting up coal stations abroad. I think ideally you'd have a commitment domestically as well, but I think coal was the one thing I want to really double down on. Another one that we've spoken about in the past is border carbon adjustments, which I don't think is probably realistic at this stage, but I think that's something that conversation needs to continue, because a lot of the industrial decarbonisation which we have will not be possible, and we will not be able to stay competitive without border carbon adjustments. But I think it will probably take until the EU do that for us to follow suit.
Clem?
There's actually a sort of live discussion for Octopus at the moment, because we are thinking of entering the Indian market. But it's very difficult for us to do that because the energy market in India is not liberalised, and so it's actually very difficult for businesses to invest, to innovate there. So actually, I'd say sort of success at COP looks like helping other countries, and by the way Britain as well. But we have been leading the way to open up their economies to investment from green energy providers, or to renewables in general, and to decarbonisation. Because actually, I think this is the last. We talked about our kind of last best chance. It's also the last COP, I believe, where it kind of really matters what governments do, because business is taking it from here. We have reached that tipping point now where clean power, renewable power, is cheaper, and therefore economies run by renewable power are going to be stronger than those that aren't. And so it is inevitable. It's just about the pace of change and how governments can act to speed it up. But it doesn't have to be about massive investment of budget. It actually can just be about how we regulate our markets better to enable that investment.
Andrew?
Well, I love what Clem just said, actually, because that wasn't on my list, and it absolutely should be. I do think, although everything that happens at COP is incredibly important, I think Professor Nick said, to a degree, it's largely done its work. I mean, these big global summits are a convening point, and there is a crescendo of momentum. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is all of your money. I mean, that's the pension fund money that you invest. It's the savings in the bank. It's all of the world's largest deployers of capital have signed up to net zero. We talked a little bit earlier about standards. There is a standard as it sits today, the race to zero, UNFCCC standard. It requires companies or any actor, it could be a city-state, to sign up to be net zero no later than 2050. Remember, in the UK, that is the law, the highest form of commitment that any government can give, and to halve your carbon emission by 2030, which is the much more bitey one, but the one that we really need if we're going to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, almost all of the world's largest capital investors have signed up to that. So they're on the hunt for deploying exactly the sort of propositions that Clem talked about. So the world has moved very significantly. Now, there's a tail. So if the UK and a couple of other leading countries are right at the apogee of this, then of course one of the benefits of getting everybody together physically in Glasgow is to sort of push the tail and encourage people to move up that curve. But as Clem says, actually this will happen anyway, because we've started to go to the next level of people designing resilience, designing sustainability in their business, and deploying capital. And markets, and this is where we all have to double down our efforts, because we can't take it. I spend time, as Greg does, in the business community, and most of us probably take it as axiomatic that business and private capital are part of the solution. And the reality, Conservative friends, is that there are people that think it's the system that will cause the problem. That's not the case. It's the system, it's business and private capital that is absolutely the solution. And the world's worst thing in terms of tackling climate from here on in would be if it became the retreat to big states, inefficiency, non-dynamic ability to make these changes as quickly as possible. That would be the world's worst thing for real action on climate. But as we can see, with people gluing their hands to all sorts of things, that case has to continually be made. So all of you can play your role in solving the climate crisis by continuing to champion the life-giving benefits of private capital, of freedom, and of efficient capital markets.
I was going to open up questions to the floor. I'm sure you've got lots of questions at this point. This gentleman, if you could just get the microphone. And sorry, I've got microphone transition issues.
Thanks. Phil Hall from AAT, that's the Association of Accounting Technicians. Just feel that government is somewhat shooting itself in the foot in terms of not just contradictory tax policy, but policy that specifically undermines net zero ambitions. So Clem, you'll be aware, for example, increasing VAT on renewables while decreasing it on coal. You talked about aviation, Ted, and of course there's just been a consultation closed to scrap or reduce air passenger duty on short-haul flights. Business rates investment, if you put solar panels on your business, you end up paying more business rates, so there's a disincentive there. There are so many little things like this which all add up to sort of send a rather negative message, which is completely contradictory to the net zero commitment. So, Greg, perhaps you could have some conversations with your colleagues and former colleagues in Treasury about this.
Yeah, thanks. And look, I mean, we've got a budget coming up, and I remember as a Treasury Minister never to comment on tax policy just a few weeks before a budget on the 27th of October. But look, I mean, I think overall the government, I mean, there's a massive part of the government's agenda. From the Prime Minister, a passionate speech at the UN just a couple of weeks ago, through to the way he communicates with the Cabinet the importance of this. I can't talk about specific taxes, but what I would say, this is a massive part of the government's agenda, and I think that will be reflected more in all parts of the government agenda as we go forward. I think that's probably the best way of putting it, but you make good points on VAT and good points on APD.
Kulveer, do you want to come back to any of the points?
No, I think as businesses, you're right. It gets very confusing, especially as we work across markets and we're seeing the different policies coming in and how we navigate through that. But also because we want to be transparent about what we're doing, and that's where you'll hear the phrase ESG, environment, social governance, coming through a lot from corporate entities. Because as much as the policies come through, we must make it clear what we're actually doing, what we're achieving, so that we don't then continually have different policies changing it because they haven't seen the outcomes and government doesn't see the outcomes that it's looking for. So we'd like an element of sustainability around ESG policy, that to come through the procurement of big contracts. Believe you me, the procurement rules do change a lot, Andrew. And I think it can be counterintuitive because you're trying to get the right result. We're a strategic supplier to government, but continually changing what government wants doesn't always get them the right result and doesn't always integrate. So ESG, continuity, transparency. Just coming back from COP though, Charlotte, I would also just add two other things. One is we must ensure we engage the country in this. I think it's very easy that these big conferences can end up having lots of people coming, something going on up there, even lots of media there, but the rest of us wonder what the hell happened. What was the outcome? I think there has to be a moment. I'm sure, if I know anything about the Prime Minister, he'll be wanting to get that out, what happens, and I'm sure, Greg, you and Andrew will be playing a role in that. But we must engage the country in what happens in Glasgow, and therefore what's requested after it. I think finally, from a business perspective, as a technology business, I will keep replaying the mantra. We have a role to tell the story of what technology can do in helping in this conversation. We've produced this paper. I hope as many of you have got a copy of it or can access it digitally. It's always available online. What technology is doing in the background is equally, if not more important, to everything that we're going to do in the foreground in making sure that we get to net zero and we live sustainably. And I think the more pressure consumers can put on having that visibility around the technology they're using, I think will drive better results. We're doing it anyway, but there's a lot of our peer group who could all be doing a lot more. So that's the three things that I'd like to see coming out of COP.
Brilliant. And I see we have more questions, so have you got the microphone? Oh, yeah, you're ready.
Can I use it?
Yeah, go for it.
I didn't want to be rude and just take the mic. My name's Russell Perrin. I'm a rare thing. I'm a Conservative and a teacher. You don't get too many of them about, I'm told. I agree with a lot of what's been said today. I'm really, really excited by what's going on, but I wonder if government is meant to create the environment for market forces to play their role. Do you think the government was a little bit too keen to promote electric vehicles as early as it did, in the sense of the tax that we get from petrol at the moment is a large part of the Exchequer's take? And if we all move to electric vehicles, has that not opened up a problem for the future? Whereas if we'd encourage maybe other technologies into that area, like hydrogen or proton cells, perhaps then the market and the consumer could have made the decision more easily rather than rushing to electric vehicles, which in themselves I don't have a problem with but I can see there are other problems coming down the line, particularly if you try to differentiate between the electric I use in my home to put the heating on and cook, and the electric I need to go to work. And I wonder if now we're there, what are the plans to try and solve this problem?
Andrew, do you want to come back to that?
No, I want to know more about, what is it, a proton cell or something? This sounds miraculous. Look, it's always going to be a balance, and I mean, government. We're going to have to love government as we find it. We can seek to improve it. It's never going to be quite as joined up as we might like. It's a big, complex human organisation, and having run one in private business, I recognise some of those challenges when you try and apply them to government. And similarly, in a space where technology is moving incredibly quickly, we're always going to be either a little bit too early or a little bit too late. And I think to a degree we have to roll with it. That's not to say that you shouldn't be incredibly strident in holding people to account, asking people to follow through on the actions that they're making. The government's communications on this, I don't know, I'm a friendly, constructive critic of government. But in this domain, as Greg has pointed out, the clarity of communication is really good. I mean, you can download these little, it's almost like a set of Dickensian instalments. You know, we had the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, very readable. We had the Chancellor's growth strategy, which had very much of the clean growth agenda in it. We've got the energy white paper. They're all actually quite readable, and people can, they're consultation documents, so invariably you can respond to that as well. So I'm pushing back a little bit, I think, that you're always going to slightly be here. And the metaphor I use when talking to businesses is like talking to executives about digital 21 years ago. Now, I'm older than most of you young progressive conservatives in the room, and I remember the Mosaic browser and my very first email address. And that was very clunky, and it was very imperfect, and I can see I'm dating myself terribly with some people in the back of the room. But of course, you know, technology moved really, really quickly, and now we have infinitely, access to power and data and knowledge, and businesses along the way have consumerized that. And to my earlier point, people have built enormous businesses. Clem's involved in one right now. Kulveer's another. And there'll be new names, new mega corporations who are super successful in solving this problem, which is we're all on a journey. The destination is very, very clear. The pathways we're going to take to get there, not so clear. And I think the greatest business, private capital, as well as governmental opportunity is how do we make those pathways as quick and as clear as we can. And that will be the way to, great prosperity for society, but as well as for individuals.
Great. And Clem, did you want to add to the
I was just... So Octopus, when we decide to invest in something, we go back to first principles. So we invested in renewable energy because it is fundamentally better and more efficient than the alternative. We invested in electric vehicles because they are fundamentally better and more efficient than the alternative. And we will be, and we are investing in heat pumps, and we'll be halving the cost of a heat pump within the next year and bringing it to parity with a gas boiler very soon after that, because they are fundamentally better and more efficient technologies. So I think we have to take the same approach with tax policy. We can't, you can't have tax policy leading the physics. You have to have the physics leading the tax policy. We can't, there's a kind of another mantra in business, which is to make what you can sell, don't sell what you can make. You don't decide the tax policy you want or the business model you want and then go and lobby for that. You go back to first principles. You work out how we're going to achieve a fundamentally better and more efficient economy, and then you work out what tax signals you need to send to people in order for them to kind of to achieve that behavioural shift and market shift to achieve that. So yes, you're right that the tax take from petrol is going to be a bit of a headache for Treasury, and we'll need to look at alternative ways of raising that revenue. For example, with help me out, road pricing. Thank you. But it would be madness to invest in a different technology that's not as good simply because the tax policy doesn't fit.
Would anyone else like to add to the question, or shall I? I'll move. Well, we've got more questions. Over there, the lady over there. Hello.
My name's Marika Graham-Woods. I'm the Deputy Chairman for Hemel Hempstead, and I am also a Director in the Cannabis Trades Association. My question really is to do with building. Twofold. The first is that new buildings should already be built with heat pumps, and I think the second is that from my trade association point of view, I have a number of building companies who want to be able to grow hemp in this country so that they can produce hemp bricks, hemp tiles, and so on. That's my question, and I'd just like to know if we're actually grown up and grounded on this issue. Thank you.
What do you think, Andrew?
What do I think? Look, there's a body I've worked with, the Construction Leadership Council, who've set up Construct Zero. And this, by the way, is another way that we're all teaching ourselves the knowledge that we need. We're hunting out, as a society, new suppliers. Perhaps they will be hemp. I'm not qualified to comment, but they may well be more natural materials. We're seeing in construction significant replacement of steel. Even though we can now generate low carbon steel, and we've got programs in place to do that with glulam for the fabric of buildings. There are hydrogen diggers. So the people talk about the built environment, and definitely the built environment has got further to go on this. But there are huge opportunities as well. There are now, for the first time, zero carbon buildings in construction, as well as zero carbon in use. I'll stop here, but my final point is, it's maybe a little bullish, but I believe, and from the journey I've been on over the last 15 months, mankind has every technology that we need to solve this crisis. They all exist. When Kennedy announced that we were going to the moon, there were large parts of that journey that simply had not been in existence by science. And in 8 years later, they landed on the moon, having conquered these uncharted, dark spaces of knowledge. My contention in the net zero space, the road to the decarbonisation economy, is that all of the technologies already exist. Hydrogen's been going around for years. I didn't know about the early electric vehicles. We just need to scale them. And the best organisation known to man, developed by modern societies to scale innovation and deploy it in the largest number of consumers as quickly as possible, is business, private enterprise, entrepreneurship and private capital.
And Greg, what do you think? Will we be having hemp tiles?
I'm not sure about that. But what I would say is we do need to do better on our building efficiency. That's what, when I talk about the huge successes this country has had in the last 30 years and in the last 10 years under successive Conservative governments, actually energy efficiency has got better. Those energy efficiency certificates, the ones that are rated satisfactory, has increased quite a lot, but not quickly enough. So we do have to do much better. That's one of, if you like, one of our key aims over the next 30 years to get to net zero, is to do much better on buildings. Just coming back on tax policy. Tax policy is always a bit tricky. Sometimes the Treasury will set a tax policy where they know that the revenue from that tax will go down, and quite deliberately. So when we introduced the soft drinks industry levy in 2015, for example, we knew that it would lead to a change of behaviour and that the revenue would decrease. So you can do that. But you do have to be careful in designing tax policy. I'll give you another example. When it comes to air passenger duty, when the Treasury looked at, quite logically, why does an individual passenger, pay air passenger duty? I think it's £13 at the moment, or £14 for a short-haul European flight. Shouldn't it be paid by the plane or by the sector? I mean, it's the airline / the plane that is doing the polluting, not the individual passenger. And it sounded like a great idea, and we went down that road of looking at reforming from per passenger to per plane. And it just turned out in the end, if you like, the complications of running that tax and the efficiency of that tax and the unforeseen behavioural changes it would lead to, like a large number of cancellations of planes that were were half empty and so on, which was probably quite short notice. In the end, it was just easier to stick with APD in its relatively simple form. So you've got to be careful on some of these things. You can't just put a kind of a green perspective on your tax system without thinking about social justice, without thinking about affordability, collectability in your taxes and so on. So it can get a bit more tricky than that.
Let's have another question. This gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Robert McElveen from the Mineral Products Association, so representing some of the more energy-intensive construction industries. Good news is, last couple of weeks we've been running a hydrogen trial in one of the cement kilns. We've had the first net zero fuel mix for making one of the most carbon-intensive products, which is great news. The bad news is it's really expensive and it's going to be really difficult to roll it out commercially. So really the question is, how can governments support hard to decarbonise industries that are trade exposed, decarbonise rather than just jack up the price and then the production goes offshore?
Nick, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, in many senses, net zero is a great opportunity in a serious way for actually reshoring and bringing jobs back to UK. And I think this is where we do need upfront government investment, maybe through risk guarantees, through the UK Infrastructure Bank, to think about actually how we can drive down the cost of these solutions, like hydrogen, in the same way as was done from offshore wind, which, as we've heard, was seen as a very, very high cost option, but with a package of measures, in market incentives, public finance through the then Green Investment Bank, and also standards, we can drive things down. So I think hydrogen and the foundation sectors is the next one, and I think that also feeds very much into the levelling up agenda for core regions of the economy. So again, that is one where we are going to need to see some upfront capital, but again, I think we can do it in a way that's going to be efficient for the taxpayer.
And Ted?
I think it's a really important point, and we need to learn the lessons of the past as well. That a lot of these, look at electric vehicles, for instance. The vast majority of the supply chain is overseas, and we did a paper looking at how we decarbonised sort of 12 big carbon-intensive industries, and sort of steel and cement is one of those as well. And I think we looked at the possibility of having in the offshore wind sector deal, for instance, there's a content requirement for a certain amount of manufacturing to happen in the UK. I think that could definitely be explored for other industries such as cement, and if you twinned that with border carbon adjustments, like I said before, then you actually create an environment where you can bring those industries back to the UK, and then it becomes a real sort of employment and economic opportunity for the UK. As I said, bringing industries back.
You, sir.
Hi there, Chris Manson-Wynn. I'm part of delivering a project called HyNet, which is looking to do the same kind of thing. We actually made our first glass with hydrogen just a few weeks ago, so nice reference earlier. Yeah, just moving on from that, I think we are seeing customers wanting low carbon products, which is great, but it is going to need infrastructure for industry, both carbon capture and storage infrastructure and hydrogen infrastructure. We welcome the 10-point plan and having those industrial decarbonisation clusters, but our concern is that only having two means that across a whole country it's not going to be possible to be even. You can't have the West at the expense of the East or the East at the expense of the West. Could you say anything about how you might be looking to stretch your ambition as part of COP to make sure that we have industrial infrastructure across the country?
Greg?
Yeah, I mean, we are very ambitious in this space, and you'll know the prominence given to carbon capture, utilisation, storage and hydrogen in the 10-point plan, and the hydrogen strategy published just a few weeks ago. We are looking at all of these things, and please wait for our coming imminently our net zero strategy, which will say more. But I don't want to particularly preempt that today, but I think you make a good point about clusters and CCUS, making sure with all of these technologies, scaling up does reduce costs. A point made by Andrew and I think others earlier. Nuclear, I think, will also be the same. Building Hinkley Point C is a big investment. Building more will, if you like, lessen the unit costs of that investment. CCUS may well have a similar economy attached to it, but we're looking at that for the net zero strategy.
And Andrew?
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, everything I've heard is the ambition is not capped at 2. It's a sort of slightly semantic debate about ordering and how that flows. Is what I've always understood, that this country can support many of these innovation and technologies, and it's just where you start. Congratulations on your net zero cement. You see, it's a perfect example of how people are pioneering. Dare say that wasn't at scale, but we can pioneer. We can see how these technologies work. One of the, I'll give you a metric, but one of the things, together with initiatives like GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, is that over half of all of the UK's leading companies, the FTSE 100, over half of them have signed up to aggressive science-based targets compatible with 1.5 degrees. And that's significant on a number of levels. One, it just shows we have a very progressive, very outward-looking business community who are really engaged and putting capital to work in this topic. But secondly, that is how scaling happens globally. The UK is a very big international economy, and a disaster, as we've discussed earlier, would be if we somehow throw everything that humankind has understood about the benefits of comparative advantage in free trade. Yes, we need some data standards, so we track the true cost of shipping things from one part of the world to another. That needs to be part of it, but we mustn't lose the benefits of comparative advantage. And because UK businesses, with their extended global tentacle supply chains into every part of the world, have committed to decarbonise, they will be putting their arms around suppliers all around the globe, trying to help them on that journey. So we've got a big issue with SMEs. Of course, the sharpest challenge if you're an SME is the opportunity cost on your time. And when you're dealing with COVID and red tape and the challenges of making sure you've got enough employees to turn up to work on Monday, it is a big ask to say, in addition to all of those things, could you deploy some of your very precious time and get yourself smart on net zero? But my message is, we don't have to do that. We have to buy into the overall destination, and then over time, we will cascade the knowledge of how to do it. People will find new techniques to make that simple. We will come up, with the help of people like Nick and Kulveer, great ways of measuring and standardising all of this, and new products and technologies will help. So I do think we do have to think of, the little guy or girl in this whole conversation, make sure it's not to their exclusion, but not worry obsessively in that we're all going to move on this journey together. And if we all move at the same time, it's breathtakingly easier, because the person that's supplying your transport or your materials is also trying to find new ways, and the summation of all of that is the net zero, low carbon economy.
Let's take another question. This gentleman here.
Hi there, thank you. Is that working?
I'm not
I can
sure.
hear you though.
There we go. Yeah, thank you all. I wanted to, a few things sort of noticed earlier, Kulveer earlier talking about clear signals, and Andrew, you just talking about sort of all agreeing on the destination ultimately that we're going here. And I wanted to ask about directors' duties and the purpose of the company. And you may have all have seen that the British Academy recently completed its 4-year research project into the future of the corporation. And part of that, the conclusions there were that actually directors' duties needed a look, and actually what we need to do is clarify those directors' duties and to enshrine the importance of directors owing responsibility to wider society and of course to the environment. And I just wanted to ask the panel what they thought the role of directors' duties would be in achieving net zero.
Ted, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is really my bag, but I'll give it a go. No, I think, there's like, obviously it's huge sort of corporate responsibility, and there's a lot of business leaders that are acting on this. You look at what Octopus did. Sorry.
No. After you.
Oh, right, sorry. And I think, you see more and more people coming out and making big moves on this, and actually the sort of market is going in that way, that actually if you don't have directors really sort of playing their part, then these businesses are not sort of excelling at the same rate. So I think I'm sure. I think maybe best to go to Nick after me. But no, I think you're right. There's a sort of an emphasis on it.
Nicholas.
Sorry, I was trying to catch your eye. No, I mean, clearly in terms of sort of the financial institutions and banks and so on, I think what we've seen very clearly is the government has set this net zero target, is now coming through the plan, the net zero strategy that we've heard. And I think the same is now expected of the corporate sector. And so I think the next thing is really expectation on businesses, banks, investors having their own net zero transition plans, which obviously has board sign-off. And I think that does then link to directors' duties and thinking about the long-term impact of the company, but also how they're going to be serving different communities. So that's probably the next big thing. And our view and a view of others is that that's going to need to be a mandatory thing, that as we go from net zero target, come up with a credible transition plan which shows how you can get there, signals to your investors, but also shows how you're going to deliver on these different aspects, and that links to purpose.
Kulveer?
Yeah, directors' duties, but as you say, it's corporate responsibility. But how do you sign that? And a lot of authenticity is required here. We've all been through the era of greenwashing and people sort of saying, we're talking about transparency and how do we absolutely show that what we're doing is what we're saying we're doing, etc., etc. But look, I'm really proud to say from our business perspective, our new CEO, Elie Girard, global CEO, a year and a ago stood up, said, right, we're going to have a very clear vision of, as a business, what we want to do and what we want to provide. And it's rather simple. It's decarbonise, secure digital services. That's it. And we've put decarbonisation at the very front of everything we're doing. And if we've got about 120,000 people across the globe working in every sector of society, public and private, with that mission, with that aim, I think we get in the right direction to doing what we're trying to do.
And Andrew?
Yeah, I find inspiring the work of the B Corps movement, and we have some of the greatest concentrations of B Corps in the UK now of any country in the world. That's a movement that goes above and beyond the statutory mandated directors' duties. I have to be honest, I think in the race to make rapid progress on this, voluntary endeavours, such as Say on Pay that Chris Hahn is sponsoring for the very largest companies, or Say on Climate, the B Corps movement that any business themselves can rapidly move and join, is a better way to go than what would, I'm afraid, be a lawyer's charter of taking a set of long-standing legal traditions and definitions that have been litigated extensively about what directors' duties are, coming up with new statute, invariably relatively slowly because that's how the legislation process works, and then starting that process again. So clearly the right responsibility is for society, for government as a procurer, and for consumers with their voting every day with their feet in their wallet to demand the very highest standards and moving standards as well, which is one of the reasons why I personally think legislation in this area is a little bit of a misnomer. But I absolutely understand the sentiments of those behind it, and I would urge every business to aspire to the very highest standard, and the B Corps movement has done great work in this space.
Okay, let's have one more question. The lady there.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kate Young from the Aldersgate Group. We're a business membership organisation. I just wanted to pick up on the theme of cost, and I wonder whether the panel agrees that we need to shift the framing on cost. There's recent data that suggests if the government invests 16 billion in the period up to 2025, that could crowd in 106 billion from private investment. So do we need to move the conversation away from cost and see it as investment instead?
Clem, do you want to comment?
Yeah, actually, and that leads. I wanted to come back on the hydrogen point earlier, so it kind of leads perfectly onto that. Yeah, I mean, we've talked a bit about pump priming, and absolutely, the best way that we can grow our economy is by investing money into innovation and helping to scale that as quickly as possible. What I would say though is we need to be careful about where that is, and I think actually one of the conversations that we need to shift on cost is this idea that there's a sort of linear relationship between tax pounds spent and outcomes on green. And actually, what we need to make sure is that we're spending it in a very smart way. And coming back to that hydrogen point, I therefore say, that is one area we should be very careful. a sort of kind of beware Greeks bearing gifts on the kind of hydrogen infrastructure, because actually, the topic of the panel, I think, is without breaking the bank. And what we need to be very careful is that we don't listen to, for example, regulated monopoly companies who have a vested interest in prolonging their own assets and getting as much out of them as possible, who therefore are highly incentivized to tell government that they need to build lots more expensive infrastructure. What we need to be doing is making sure that we are investing money into innovation and into scaling up technologies that we can then stand back from, not locking us into an expensive future.
Yeah. Ted, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, echoing exactly what Clem said there as well. I think there's, we need to be sensible about how that money is spent, and I agree. I think spending a lot of money on hydrogen infrastructure, where I'm not even sure where we're getting all this hydrogen from. But I think that we need to be careful about how we do that. And I think, going back to your question around how we can sort of catalyse private investment, I think the UK Infrastructure Bank really is a sort of a golden opportunity to do that. So I'm keen to see, how that progresses, and see how that private capital can really be channeled in.
I just wanted to make one thing very clear. Hydrogen is a very important fuel for making things like cement. So we need, to answer your question actually earlier about how do we make sure it doesn't cost too much, part of the way we do that is we make sure we use it wisely, and we don't use it unwisely in, for example, heat, where electrification is fundamentally cheaper. So we should make sure that we're targeting technologies and spending at places that needs it, rather than unnecessarily propping up incumbent industries.
Would anyone else like to add a last thought before we've got 1 minute?
Well, just go.
Yeah, just really quick, and that is, I think, the role of government in all of this is not to take over, but to lead, influence, and lead by example when it comes to the funding. If you want to see where government taking over leads, one of my favourite books to read, which virtually nobody reads these days, is Joel Barnett's account of being Chief Secretary of the Treasury in the 1970s, when people like Tony Benn and Barbara Castle were running the spending departments, and Tony Benn pitching for yet more Concords that were ultimately going to end up being unsold. So there's a very, very good lesson there in why government shouldn't take over. But government can lead, can influence. I'll take you just one example. I was in Blyth last week, and there's an amazing story around Blyth as being an area of Britain's previous the first industrial revolution, and now really a big part of the green industrial revolution. And on the very site in Blyth, where one of the world's largest and actually quite efficient for its day coal-fired power stations has been demolished. And now, with assistance from the government, but there's a £130 million investment going in on that very site to produce cabling for offshore wind. And actually, we've taken an incredible thing. There's one of the most iconic sites in Britain's coal-fired past, turning it into a site for Britain's renewable-based future, with a bit of government money, but almost all of that money coming from the private sector. And that's the sort of thing that we should see more of.
Well, we're going to have to come to an end now with our discussion. I think it's been a fantastic chat today. I've certainly learned a huge amount. I'd like to thank all of our panellists for coming along. I'd like to thank our partner Atos, and I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your presence and fantastic questions. So have a very great day.